Thanks to all the people that have been working to get this series together from many different spheres, including our friends at the Yater Institute in Australia, Michaela Kennedy, and obviously thanks to you, Hans, for taking the time to take this session on.
I'll just do a little brief introduction. These Wicked Wednesday series were the came out of the creative energy of a group of people that really were connecting across the planet in terms of how to handle reflective practice without getting together, given pandemic all over the world, and landed on the thought that these Wicked Wednesdays would be at least a nice way to connect. And at some point, maybe in the future, there'll be opportunities to get together personally. So the theme for this series of conversation was that person-centered planning become systemized and lost its magic. So we have the check-in question today is on the screen. It's simply to type in a question that you might have or an interest you have that brings you here today to this Wicked Wednesday conference session. And I'd like to tell a little bit of a story prior to going into a World Cafe format, which we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like after I finish my story and you jump into breakout groups, maybe some of you will relate to my story. Maybe some of you have been around as long as I have. Maybe some of you are newly to the field. But I started working with people with intellectual disabilities back in the mid-70s, really as a volunteer, and then joined an ARC in New York State, in Troy, New York. And we didn't look too different than a lot of ARCs at that point in time, which was the beginnings of the development of community services for people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities, mainly driven by the deinstitutionalization process that was happening in New York State at the time. And I think you all probably had some experience of large institutions that drifted into places of significant neglect and abuse and overpopulation. And New York State looked to the nonprofits to build programs and services for people with developmental disabilities, but basically community residences, shelter workshops, state treatment programs, and so forth. So, as I was on the learning curve going forward in the latter 70s, it didn't take much long for most of us in my particular agency to realize that we weren't really getting people into the community. There was something else going on that wasn't quite right. Even though we were sort of a lot better than the institution, we realized that a lot of people were still isolated, segregated, and disconnected to their own home, a job, a relationship. And right about that time, probably a little earlier, a guy named Wolf Wolfensberger came out with his social analysis of marginalized and devalued peoples. And the insight was that people with intellectual disabilities was basically a social issue and not singularly a question of disability, which is a real kind of mind-boggling shift, because most of the time people thought, well, these are people who are incapacitated, and that would be a relatively nice word comparative to what the labels were at that point in time. And I think you all know what I'm talking about. Basically, he said people of difference are often isolated, diminished, lonely, and embedded in life-denying experiences. Now, this particular point of view really, I think, fueled the early emergence of person-centered planning. And I think I give a lot of credit to a man named John O'Brien, who took Wolfensberger's analysis pretty seriously, but he said, okay, what does that mean for us providers? What do we do with that kind of depressing piece of information? And he came up with a framework for facilitation and working with people, sort of action-based as well, based on what he called the valued outcomes or accomplishments, which, for example, increasing participation, assisting people assume valued roles, contribution and relationship, was all about the question of social integration into the community. And around that particular time, a person influenced by John was a woman named Beth Mount. Probably you all know who she is. She came up with her own form of person-centered planning called personal futures planning. And I think she was influenced by techniques from the field of organization development around large group facilitation, such as future search, conference, and methods like that, which had planning methodology that allowed for suspension of assumptions about people and things and possibilities, and moved away from the expert model into or medical model into a what now is referred to as a dialogic model, where we are dialoguing as people and partners together. And World Cafe really comes out of that tradition as well. So she was very influenced by that on one hand. On another hand, she was also influenced by feminist ethics, which moved the hierarchy of Maslow's from, personally transcendent concepts and principles to the highest order being healthy relationship. And so that became part of, as well, her orientation, which was also emanates from the Wolfensberger social analysis of moving out of the medical model into a social dynamic. So these really were sources of inspiration for us at the ARC. My own experience, this sort of, my background is organization development, so it sort of paired my interest in working with organizations and communities with my interest in working with people with disabilities. So really turned me on a great deal, and I was able to enact some of this and moving people from even our group home arrangement into individualized supports, closing down a shelter workshop, really attempting to connect people to community. Obviously not so easy, and it continues. It's not something that just happens overnight. It goes point A to point B. It's much more emergent and dynamic than that. But it certainly was an alternative to, and in many ways, a reaction to entrapment in program settings. And Beth Mount always talked about just opposing the systems point of view in terms of planning, and then the person-centered planning point of view. And there were elements that were very different in either one. One was about control and quick movement to convergence into plans and programs and services, while person-centered planning was more about convergence and divergence and possibility, and sort of keeping in the, keeping the game going rather than closing it down quickly. And so that was very exciting. And I think the system itself, also including people who really cared about people with IDD, and policymakers began taking notice about person-centered planning, and they started moving it into the regulatory environment, which was sort of positive and what advocates were interested in seeing. But that something happened in terms of a drift. That drift, I call it a practical drift maybe, found its way into the efficiency and control model of regulatory funding systems. And after a while, instead of it becoming, giving faith to the local application of person-centered planning, became prescriptive in its requirements around person-centered planning. And then all of a sudden we began to see leaking into person-centered planning systems an over-focus on disability and vulnerabilities as a population, and the depersonalization of the planning process, the same questions for the same people. And I think you all know now that the experience that we see is states are implementing assessment tools that have kind of check boxes and drop-down menus that lead you to particular outcomes and goal planning. And so all of a sudden, most of our attention begins to move towards away from the individual and towards compliance, being very worried about not meeting requirements and having takebacks of funding. And interestingly enough, maybe not so interesting, maybe more depressing, is that New York State, as far as my experience with it, I left the organization that I worked for 40 years, 3 years ago. But I still think these practices are in. New York State started coming up with assessment tools for organizations around person-centered planning and application. And one of those protocols, investigation protocols, was 1,400 pages long. Now, I don't know what you do with 1,400 pages of check boxes to see if organization is doing person-centered planning. But boy, talk about distraction. So if I were to stop the story now, it wouldn't be so much a story of inspiration, but of dissipation and depression. But I think what I've been noticing and experiencing as there are more and more people realizing that this drift has occurred away from kind of the authentic person-centered work that I mentioned in the originators, all the way to it being captured by systems and funding and regulatory environments. And so I'm beginning to see a resurgence of people. Maybe the source is parents, allies, and people with disabilities are saying, I want a life and not a program. And so we begin to see people attempting to reclaim the heart, soul, and purpose of PC, person-centered planning. And it really is coming from people who are seeing that their highest potential as people is to work with opening up the community away from narrow definitions of what is a community member to a more inclusive, diverse presentation of people and difference in community. So it's not just simply we're taking an individual and building a bridge for that individual to travel to community, but to open up the boundaries of community to be more present to people. And so these large group planning sessions that I mentioned that inform person-centered planning in the beginning are beginning to show up in practices now where organizations, individuals are inviting the community in to plan with people with disabilities alongside them to create new innovative ways of being in community as well as supporting people with disabilities. So the inspiration comes from this movement of doing things differently. And I could certainly name other pathways. For example, there's some energy out of MIT in Boston, where you have people talking about learning organizations and Theory U. Those are references you could check out on your own, just Google them, that are attempting to do something similar about reconnecting people to the heart and soul and purpose of being a human being, really. So that's my story. I think we're coming kind of a full cycle away from the original emergence of person-centered planning as a tool for social or a way of being for social justice and social inclusion, to the constriction in terms of commodification and regulatory requirements and prescription, to a reopening up a possibility of something different in terms of relationship and connection. So I don't know if you relate to all that, but that's my experience. And we're gonna now move into a World Cafe format. And so we might want to start with just what World Cafe is. As I mentioned before, it's a dialogic method. It's like the metaphor is we're hanging out at a cafe and we're engaged in some really meaningful conversation with one another. It's together. We're interested in hearing each other's point of view. As you mentioned, as the graphic on the here suggests, that it's about not just about the way I think, but it's how we can think together, collective intelligence. We're looking for patterns in our conversation that connect us. Obviously, you're both trying to articulate your own point of view in a conversation, but you're also trying to deeply listen to the other person. So some real good listening skills are there. And an ability to draw people in terms of contribution. So it's not one or two people conversing, but trying to open it up. To go first, you got 2 minutes. Who's a reporter? Go refer to your nuggets. And you have 2 minutes.
What we had was really making sure that we are not only engaging, but those that are engaging, increasing their engagement in their whole person-centered planning process, and making the plan narrative more about the person than in the past, as well as really bringing notice to the value that the person can contribute, so whether it be in personal relationships and connecting in the community.
And did you have any systems obstacles you came up with?
Mainly funding, to making sure that everybody has the training and support that's necessary to make that engagement happen.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a group 2?
So we had some barrier discussions around state oversight of being really focused on making sure that nothing bad happens to people, and how much that can really limit what kind of adventures people can go on. And but as a mission for what we do about that is to be really strong advocates, and to sort of something, the first time we started really doing person-centered planning in Maine in a mandated kind of way, we had this one person who was supposed to do that job, and the sort of motto was like, I've got your back. Like, you do whatever you want, we'll plan it, we'll figure it out, I'll take the heat. And I heard that from a couple of the people in our group, like, we'll take all the flack, like, we'll figure out how to do what you want to do, and just really defending that. And then the last thing was really about saying, instead of what the system can do for the person, what are all the supports, the natural supports that you can do to build up around the person, and then you go to the system to ask for those supplemental things to sort of make it happen. And when you look through that lens, you're more likely to really be able to get what people need in a holistic way.
Great.
Yeah, we talked about, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, to make sure that people's needs, their real needs, their wishes and dreams are met. That people have an opportunity to live real lives of meaning, that are rich lives that are meaningful to them, their lives, not what somebody else is prescribing, that their voice is actually heard, and that we remain human-centered and make sure that that is the first thing that is addressed, that this is a human being, a person, not a systemic, service recipient kind of thing, that we really need to stay true to our values. So that's what we want to attempt to accomplish in our person-centered practices. The barriers that we talk about are obstacles, is that the values have become completely separated from the practice, and the state or whatever entity, funding entity, puts it's pig with lipstick. It's, they call it person-centered planning, but it's really just a medical authorization for, and there's really nothing person-centered at all when they systemize it. We spend a ton of time and energy trying to meet the needs of the state, and it's exhausting, and it takes up a ton of time and energy and it on the practice, but not on our values. And I have this great quote from Sherry out in Washington that is, systems, no matter what they are, all the systems that we work in are exhausting, but our values are fortifying. And I love that. That's my nugget for the day that I'm taking with me from Sherry. Thank you, Sherry.
Great, thank you. Love the quote.
Getting back to real person-centered planning, so talking about how that has shifted in the last couple of years, and then we kind of talked about two obstacles around the frustration with kind of a deficit-based approach to show needs to satisfy funders, which has been mentioned, and then also the fact that we're spending dollars in our systems to do things that aren't person-centered, just to get around things and navigate how to get services and supports for people. So looking at the system as truly broken and kind of defeated in terms of how to get back to that.
Reporting out. We had some great conversations because people from very different places, those different places are in different places with what they're doing in a very big way. So lots of good conversation. We talked about one thing being a really big thing being expectations, and the goal being to use person-centered service to raise them, but families and others are often quite resistant to that, and in some places more so than others. So families might not want to involve other people in planning, or might not feel that their family member needs to learn math or do other things because they don't need that. So how do we raise expectations and help people to increase what they see as possible? We talked about how it's possible to gather meaningful information when states are mandating a checklist. And so how do you try to get that in and around what you're gathering for the checklist, or do you have to separate this entirely? I think personally, I'd like to see service planning go away and be something you do for the state, and then we do person-centered planning just because it's right. And then we also talked about the regulations tend to lead toward a binary approach. We try to check off all the boxes to meet those regulations, and could we change those regulations so that they're looking at a practice model instead of a checklist model, so that people are competent in the practice and that's what counts. And last but not least, we really want people to be active members of community, active citizens. That's the point of doing it. And of course, the obstacles are all the things that we've already talked about, but how can we help people to really be actively engaged in their communities and involve those communities in being with us in that project?
Great. One of the big takeaways for me in hearing what people are saying is kind of the weird sense that we are existing in two different realities. One is the container that we operate in terms of prescription and regulation and checklists, and the other one is if we actually have the passion and deep purpose around authentic person-centered practices, that exists in sort of another reality in a way. It's very hard to absorb both of them into a singular reality. So we sort of move in and out of those different perceptions. And I mean, depending on what your experience is, I know in New York State, it was heavily weighted in the regulatory environment. It was just overwhelming. The space for authentic practice was very constricted. And it begins reminding me of kind of like what Leonard Cohen talked about, is that in the cracks, good things happen, the light shines through. But in the cracks of the regulatory environment, authentic person-centered practice lights sort of shines through. So that's where we're going with the next question, actually, is how do we open that crack up just a little bit more in a very rigid environment? And the question in this last World Cafe round is, what can be done? And that's personally with my team in my organization to reclaim the heart, soul, and purpose of person-centered planning. What gives life to authentic person-centered practice? And as I think you know what I mean about person-centered practice. If it's the one thing that sits in a connection truly with the individual in partnership versus a checklist or whatever, we're really person-to-person connecting. So the question again, I guess Bob's trying to catch up with me, is what can be done? And it's on those levels, personally, with my team, and in my organization, to reclaim the heart, soul, and purpose of person-centered planning. And the heart, soul, and purpose really, you might say I could add in what can be done with the people I work with, but authentic person practices assumes that's already a connection, that's what it is. So you're just sort of fostering that connection with the person and their allies. What can be done personally with my team in my organization, reclaim the heart, soul, and purpose of person-centered planning? What gives life to authentic person-centered planning? So we're going to go around the rooms again. So maybe we can start with go backwards. Let's start with group 5 and hear what your nuggets are.
So our nuggets for what we can do were to have longer, deeper conversations. Like, this needs to be done in depth. It can't just be a quick one and done, in and out. We need to be asking more questions of the people involved at the center of everything, instead of prescribing services, getting stuck in that service provider trap, right? Ask authentic questions. We need to have a move towards actual competencies for people who are in charge of person-centered planning. Like, what are the real values? What are the real competencies? Can we have some steps towards competency? Oh, and I love that. And when we talk about community, it needs to be real community, not just a choice on a vending machine choice. Or my favorite quote, I'm with the quotes today, favorite quote from Sean: we shouldn't need to access the community, we live there. So when people talk about accessing the community,
no trips to the community. We went to the community today.
Right, crazy.
And I can
so
see the community really right out my window here right now. Hi, community. That's a very good point.
I attempted graphic facilitation, so I'm going to, if you don't mind, do my thing here. Having the person at the center determine the rules for planning, which rules are going to be followed, who comes, what fits, who's going to write the plan, what people can say at their meeting. Bottom line rule for doing planning. Second one was that instead of following the rules of the PCP process in the state, I love this. Steve's program just shut down their segregated program, and they're using asset-based community development. They've closed the doors. They're developing community for the people who are served there. Never mind the rules, we're just going to go do this. And then for me, what I talked about was after 30 years of avoiding it, have finally discovered the power of graphic facilitation. So I wish to go do more of that wherever anybody will have me, because I finally get it. I mean, I've always gotten it. I just was too chicken to do it. But look.
Oh, that's very nice. Good deal.
So we had somebody who does training on person-centered planning talking about really just delivering that training in the most authentic way, and to really get people invested, or in some cases reinvested, because maybe they've lost their way in the crazy system, and to inspire buy-in, to really get people feeling motivated and excited. And Then we talked about what happens, Lori just was showing her drawing, what happens when you get creative, when you put up a blank piece of paper, when you ask open-ended questions, when you start drawing pictures, when you ask people what things would look like, that ideas come out that don't happen in the sort of typical meeting setting. And when people think about a meeting, it's different. But when you have snacks and you're in somebody's living room and you've got a bunch of blank paper on the wall and markers, it inspires some more creativity. So that's something that we've really been reclaiming as an agency. And then my favorite, don't be afraid to make people angry. Somebody even said earlier, I can't remember if it was this group or the last group, but that said, if I haven't made anybody upset today, I might not be doing my job correctly.
Too bad we didn't have more time. We'd love to hear more of that story.
I know.
Hi, it's Trisha here. I'm going to go ahead and speak for our group. What I found so enjoyable about this particular group is that we have people from all over the world. So we got to see a real worldly view of the different things that are happening. And so first and foremost, providing those connections in the community, but by doing that, by connecting with community members that have like interests. So really finding those peers and those friends to be able to make that connection so that their natural supports can be developed. And I'm trying to read my notes because that's very small, but you know, those thank you so much. Those pre-employment, and let's see if I can move it a little bit. Pre-employment, sorry, and referrals for jobs, connections through volunteers where can sometimes lead to paid employment, and then offering up clubs and classes and groups, but not in the setting of a day program, allowing and empowering the people that we serve to actually, you know, go out and create their own groups by offering to teach someone how to crochet at the local library or draw at the local coffee shop or something like that. And then in India, they are, you know, they're in this process pre-pandemic where they went in and observed the schools that teach non-disabled students, and they went ahead and went back to their school and made those changes to follow the model of the other schools with the non-disabled students. They provided exposure to regular curriculums, employment programs, and you know, going out, you know, exposing people to the community because they're their parents, and oftentimes they didn't have an opportunity to do that. So they would celebrate birthdays and get to go out and enjoy activities there. We had a DSH employee on in our group, and she's struggling because, you know, she said this is a very important question, and you know that sometimes there are pockets around the state that are very person-centered, and then other times there's not. She finds that the language becomes jargon, so she likes to use just everyday language instead of referring to things as person-centered. It's just life, right? Which is really to me, I found that to be very significant, because then we're not making anything special, we're just living life. For me, I'm in an area right now where I work for a vocational rehabilitation organization that is going through a lot of changes. So I am compelled to be very asset-based and focused on strengths, and just moving people in the direction of realizing that there's so much value, and not to worry about so much about all of the things that can't happen, but what can happen.
Thank you, Tricia.
So I think the question was, what can we do as an organization? And the idea was to make sure that when we have conversations, what we're doing is to just kind of do a check-in to make sure that we are continuing to practice it, to make sure that it's not just something that we do, on Tuesday at 3 p.m., but it's something that we do, all day, every day, so that we're not, it becomes the culture of our organization. It becomes the heartbeat of our work. The second nugget that we came up with is making changes in our organization to utilize tools and practice of person-centered planning. One of the things I do in my organization is I bring in a person once a quarter. I lovingly refer to him as an elder in the person-centered, world. I was so grateful this morning when I heard you mention, John O'Brien and Beth Mount. And so once a quarter that he comes in and we have the conversations and we do the planning and we go out and we reach out to families that are struggling and people that are struggling, and we really we do a map or a path or a Liberty Plan or whatever tool we use, and we do that deeper dive for that person, and then that fuels our work, right? And it gives us something, gives us the energy that we need in order to to kind of bypass the system struggles and the people that don't want to do that work, right? That are more mired in the systems. And then we celebrate or take opportunities to celebrate person-centered practice. And I think, we, yeah, so I'm not sure, I forget exactly what we were talking about with that, but just sort of the idea is that we make sure it's something we're doing in everything that we do, that it's not just an event or it's, something that happens in a moment in time, but it's something that happens across our everyday, and it colors our conversations and the work that we do on a regular basis. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate it. Glad the references made sense to you or you connected to them. Basically, I think we've answered the question, has person-centered planning become systematized and lost its magic? It sounds like we all agree, yes, kind of has. And the idea, my subtitle was reclaiming the heart, soul, and purpose of person-centered planning. And I think the 3 words, heart, soul, purpose, actually means that this is something meaningful for each one of us ourselves. A shift really happens with ourselves because we live within systems or grew up within systems. So it's very powerful to connect to our higher purpose. What are we trying to contribute when we're working with people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities? And we use the words community and so forth. What does this actually mean to us? What's our contribution? How do we both shift internally and out of sort of the roles we play that have been dictated to us by our organization or the community, the system, and how do we figure out, how do we operate out of this higher purpose and sense of contribution to something greater than ourselves? So the shift happens with us. Then we with that, we join together in conversation like we have today. That's the point of these sessions. They're reflective opportunities to look at ourselves and our practice. And how do we become change agents for person-centered planning in an authentic way? How do we do that? And we start with ourselves. Self is the instrument for change. We then move with others, and then hopefully that influences organizations. This is a big chore. We're swimming upstream. So we have to get the we have to build the resilience for this, this work. It's not going to be prescribed to us. We know how that didn't work when it's prescribed to us by systems. So what I'd like you to do is either on the board, or if you feel more comfortable with the chat, is a little bit of a check out question, and then we're just going to close the session. So here's the question, what are your first steps to create opportunities for authentic person-centered practice? Now, you might already be in that step. So what's your next step sort of out of today's meeting? Yeah, the thought is that conversations are really the root of change. And so that's what we're attempting to do, is host these conversations and generate some energy and connection around it. So I want to thank everybody. I enjoyed meeting people from all over the states, and one person, I believe, from India. And that's very exciting. And so thank you. I think we're about done, right?